My name is Claire, and 20 years ago, I found out my boyfriend was cheating on me with his 19-year-old student. So I picked up the phone, and I didn't stop dialing until his career, his funding, and his freedom were all sitting on a table in front of a federal investigator. I thought that was the end of the story. It wasn't, because 2 decades later, he walked back into a lecture hall, my lecture hall, smiling like none of it ever happened. And that's when I found out karma had been keeping a file on him the entire time. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what it means when people say revenge is a dish best served cold. This is a completely true story from my own life. Some names have been changed, but nothing else has. Let's go back to the beginning. Picture the late 1990s. I was 21 years old, working a full-time job, still finding my footing, still believing that the person you loved was supposed to be the safest person in your life. That's the mindset I had when I met Jake. Jake was 23, already graduated, already brilliant in that specific way that makes you feel lucky just to be in the room with him. He was starting a PhD program in animal sciences on the opposite coast of the country. And here's the part that felt like fate to both of us. I was already planning to move, with friends, to a city just 90 minutes from where he was headed. Neither of us orchestrated it. It just happened. When two 20-somethings are both packing their entire lives into boxes and discover they're about to live 90 minutes apart on purpose, it doesn't feel like coincidence. It feels like the universe nodding at you. I want you to really sit in that feeling for a second, because it matters for what comes later. I wasn't naive. I wasn't desperate. I was a young woman who had found someone who made sense, who had a family I adored. 2 sisters and a younger brother, all warm, funny, easy people who folded me into their world like I'd always been there. I want you to remember them. They become important. Because I worked full-time and Jake was a student, the rhythm of our relationship became this. I would drive up on weekends. He shared a rental house with 2 roommates from his program. One of them, a guy I'll call George, would end up playing a much bigger role in this story than either of us could have predicted. Money was tight for all of them. Dates were simple. Tacos. Nights in. Jake bred and sold small animals as a side project, completely normal in his field, and honestly, I loved it. I loved watching him in his element. Through Jake, I met Mary, mid-50s, warm, sharp, married to Jake's PhD advisor. Mary worked in administration at the university, and whenever I visited on weekends, we'd have lunch together. She wasn't just my boyfriend's advisor's wife. She became my friend. Genuinely. Remember her too. Mary is the quiet hinge this entire story swings on. For 2 years, this was my life. Not perfect. Nothing real ever is, but solid. Real. Or so I thought. Here's where it starts to turn. We were lying in bed one afternoon, comfortable, undressed, the kind of quiet closeness you only have with someone you trust completely. And out of absolutely nowhere, Jake says he's noticed I've been gaining weight, and it's making him less attracted to me. No concern for my health. No, are you okay? Just a flat, cold observation about his own attraction levels, like he was reviewing a product he'd purchased. I sat up. I want you to understand, I had gained, at most, 10 pounds in 2 years. I still wore the same size clothes I always had. This wasn't a health issue. This was a man deciding, in that moment, to say something designed to hurt. But here's the thing about me. Even at 23, I didn't absorb blows like that quietly. I looked at him and said calmly, "Well, maybe you should make sure there's better food up here than crackers and cheese when I visit." He blinked. I asked him, "So what's your solution to this?" He had nothing. "I guess you should try to lose weight." "Nah," I said. "I'm not going to do that." "So what are you going to do about it?" Silence. Then, "I guess nothing. I just wanted you to know how I feel." "Cool," I said. "Thanks for letting me know." I got dressed, went to sleep, and drove home the next morning like nothing had happened. Because as far as I was concerned, nothing had happened, except that a man had shown me exactly the kind of person he was capable of being when he thought no one was watching. I didn't know it yet, but that conversation wasn't about my body at all. It was the opening move in a plan I couldn't see. 3 months later, the phone rings. Jake wants to break up. After almost 3 years together. His reason, and I want you to really hear this, because it is one of the strangest sentences a grown man has ever said to justify ending a relationship. His reason was, "You don't know enough about science." He said he felt like he couldn't talk to me about his work without switching from scientific names to common names for animals. That was it. That was the reason he gave for ending a 3-year relationship. I told him flatly that was bullshit, and I wanted the real reason. He insisted that was the real reason. A month later, he came by to return some of my things, and I confronted him face to face. And that's when it finally cracked open. He admitted it. He'd been seeing one of his undergraduate students. I'll call her Meg. She was 19. He was 26. He was her teacher that I screamed at him to get out of my apartment. My roommate told him if he didn't leave immediately, she'd throw him off our second-floor balcony. He left. And then something strange happened to me. The second the door shut, the rage didn't stay rage. It cracked into stunned, disbelieving laughter. Because I remembered something. I'd met Meg. She'd been at one of Jake's barbecues, spilled something on her pants, and Jake had actually asked me if I had sweats she could borrow. I couldn't. I was a size 8. She was a size 18. Nothing wrong with that at all. But it hit me all at once. He hadn't been complaining about my weight because he was shallow. He'd been trying to manufacture a reason for me to break up with him because he was too much of a coward to just say what was actually happening. He clearly liked her. He just didn't have the spine to be honest about it. He wanted an exit that didn't make him the villain. And when I refused to give him one, he had to become one on his own. This is where the story stops being about heartbreak and starts becoming about consequences. I emailed Jake's roommates to let them know we'd broken up and to thank them for how kind they'd always been to me. They wrote back immediately and admitted they already knew about Meg. In fact, they were the ones who had forced Jake's hand. They told him, "Tell her or we will." One of them, George, was sharp, funny, and I'll be honest, very easy on the eyes. He offered to help me collect the last of my things from the house. He suggested I come up for a weekend, go out, have a real night for once, all the things Jake had always been too cheap or too controlling to do. So I did. George let me into the house while Jake was out. And here's where I want to slow down, because this is the moment the story shifts from wounded ex-girlfriend to something far more calculated. I'd spent 2 years around Jake's animals. I wasn't a scientist, but I paid attention. And I knew, with total certainty, that among his breeding stock was an endangered species he was harboring without the required permits. It wasn't even a breeding animal. It was an unreleasable rescue he'd taken in. There was a simple $25 filing fee required to legally keep it. He refused to pay it, on principle, because he didn't want the government in his business. I took photographs. All of it. The overcrowded breeding conditions. The protected species. And one more animal, a species not legally permitted in the state at all, sitting in a tank directly in front of a window, fully visible from the street. I photographed evidence of a crime. And then I went out and had a drink. That night, George and I went out on the town properly. We came back late, deliberately timed so that Jake and Meg, curled up on the couch watching TV, would see exactly what walked through that door. Me, in a short dress, laughing, unsteady, with George practically carrying me in. I spent the night in George's room. Nothing happened beyond a bit of theater. He was a complete gentleman, but he made absolutely sure to stroll past their door in his boxers more than once. We laughed loudly. We made sure they heard us. The next morning, I walked out slowly, in the same rumpled dress, hair a mess, eating a donut like I hadn't a care in the world. Jake sneered and told me I didn't have to act like a whore in front of him. Meg wouldn't meet my eyes. George kissed the top of my head, beaming. I looked at both of them and said, "Have fun with my leftovers." And I walked out. For a moment, I actually thought that petty, theatrical little exit was my revenge. A drunk hookup, some public humiliation, a clever last word. I was wrong. That wasn't the revenge. That was just the appetizer. The next day, and this was the era of disposable cameras, so I actually had to get the film developed. I picked up the photographs and I picked up the phone. I called the State Office of Fish and Wildlife. I reported everything. The overcrowded breeding conditions. The 2 animals held in direct violation of state law. I asked them, calmly and clearly, how to formally file a complaint. Here's something I hadn't known. Jake wasn't well liked. Not by his peers. Not by his roommates. But I was liked. George and the other roommate had already been planning to file a formal complaint with the university about a teaching assistant sleeping with one of his students and showing her favoritism. That night we'd all gone out, George made absolutely sure the story of Jake and Meg reached every corner of the program. By the time the sun came up the next day, every woman in Jake's classes knew exactly who their TA was sleeping with. Then I called Mary. I told her about the breakup, about Meg, about the fact that Jake had admitted it to me in writing, over email, and that I still had that email. She was furious. She told me, right there on the phone, that this would absolutely be investigated, and I heard her, in real time, telling her husband, Jake's own direct advisor, everything I just told her. The dominoes were already falling. Jake just didn't know it yet. A few weeks later, George called me, practically vibrating with glee. State fish and wildlife officials were at the house, confiscating animals. Meg was there, and in an act of loyalty that would end up meaning absolutely nothing for her boyfriend, she told the officers that as far as she knew, every animal in that house belonged to Jake, and every one of them was legal. That statement cleared George and the other roommate completely. One animal was kept outside, so officials were tipped that a neighbor had reported it. But they also knew, because someone had told them exactly where to look, to check the window facing the backyard, where the more serious violation sat in plain view. Because George was on the lease, he let the officers in to search the shared spaces. Hours later, they came back with a warrant for Jake's room specifically. Meg couldn't reach Jake by phone. Remember, this was before cell phones were standard, so she had to physically drive to campus to find him while state officials tore through his bedroom. By the end of the day, every single animal was gone. Every one, except a small tank of guppies too harmless to bother confiscating. Here's the part that turned a bad day into a ruined career. PhD research in animal sciences runs on grant money, and a huge portion of that funding comes from the federal government. Jake had just been awarded an EPA grant right around the time he broke up with me. So I made one more phone call. To the EPA, I asked, plainly, how one would go about reporting that a federal grant recipient was currently under state investigation for illegally harboring endangered animals. The dominoes finished falling. Jake lost the grant entirely. He was ordered to repay nearly $30,000 in funds already used. He was permanently barred from receiving another federal grant. He avoided jail time on the state charges only because the animals themselves were found to be in good health, but he lost every breeding animal he owned, worth thousands of dollars, all seized during the investigation. In the end, he was fined $15,000, and the two illegally held animals were relocated to a nearby nature center. For years afterward, whenever I was in the area, I would stop by and visit them. I liked knowing they'd ended up somewhere safe, somewhere legal, somewhere better than where they'd been. The university, once the investigation reached them, revoked his scholarship and removed him from his teaching position entirely, citing the inappropriate relationship with a student. Somehow, he avoided outright expulsion. What still baffles me to this day is that he never even tried to hide the relationship with Meg. He was so certain of himself that he didn't even wait the 4 weeks left in her class before going public. If he just waited, under the university's own rules, the relationship would have been permitted. His arrogance cost him more than his cheating did. A few months after the dust settled, I reached out to Jake's sisters. I told them I missed them, and I explained, gently, that Jake had broken up with me after criticizing my weight and cheating with his student. They were stunned. Jake had told the entire family a completely different story, that I had ended things over long distance. I forwarded them his own emails. In his own words, admitting he'd fallen for Meg, admitting he felt guilty, but still insisting, absurdly, that I couldn't keep up with him academically, and that was what drew him to her. His father ended up paying for 1 additional year, so Jake could scrape together a master's degree instead of walking away with nothing. I stayed in touch with his siblings for years, through email and eventually social media. Jake and I never spoke again. I let it go. I built a career, I built a life. I got even. I made lifelong friends out of the wreckage. Mary became something like an aunt to me, and I moved forward. And here's the detail that still makes me laugh every time I tell the story. My eventual master's degree, and the career I built from it, is in helping scientists and doctors communicate complex research to everyday people. The people who don't know enough about science. I didn't plan that irony. It just happened, and I love it. Through the years, I'd hear updates through his siblings. Jake and Meg got married, had 2 kids. Meg left the sciences and became an accountant. Jake went back to breeding animals, presumably more carefully this time. At one bridal shower, years later, Jake apparently complained loudly that his siblings still treated me like family and hadn't made an effort with Meg. His sister's response became a small legend in that family. I don't make it a habit of being friends with homewreckers. That's how his parents finally learned the truth, 10 years after we broke up, that his own siblings had known the real story the entire time. Jake never found out I was the one who made those phone calls. Not one word I said to any official was a lie. The only thing I ever slightly embellished was implying George and I had done a bit more than we actually had. Now here's where the story comes back around. 20 years passed. I built an entire career on the back of that one accidental specialty, translating complicated science for regular people. I travel constantly. I lecture at universities. I work with doctors, researchers, government agencies, museums, even film and television productions. It's a good life. A full one. A few weeks ago, I was standing at the front of a lecture hall, 250 undergraduate and graduate students in the audience. Afterward, I was mingling, shaking hands, answering questions. And then I heard a voice behind me say, "Hey, Opie, long time no see." I turned around. It was Jake. I want you to know, my face didn't move. Not a flicker. My first instinct, instantly, without even deciding to do it, was to play dumb. "I'm sorry," I said, perfectly pleasant. "Help me out. Have we met at another workshop or lecture?" He looked genuinely stunned. "It's me, Jake. I can't quite place you," I said, "but I'd love to figure it out." I let him sit in that for a moment. Then I gasped right on cue. "Oh my goodness, Jake." I said I must have blocked him out entirely, told him it was lovely to see him, and moved on before he could pull me into a hug. And I walked away with a very specific, very quiet satisfaction. He was sitting in the audience of a lecture hall, and I was the one standing at the podium. Later that evening, the department chair and a few faculty members took me to dinner. Somewhere between courses, one of them asked, casually, "So you know Jake?" I kept my answer vague. "I did a long time ago." She mentioned, almost in passing, that Jake had just come through for a teaching position interview. He'd spent several days on campus observing classes. They were, she said, likely going to offer him the job. I couldn't help it. I actually scoffed out loud. They all turned to look at me. So I told them, plainly, he'd been sleeping with a 19-year-old student when he was 26, and he was her teacher at the time. He'd been forced out of his PhD program without finishing, and lost his funding entirely because he couldn't afford to stay without it. The three of them exchanged a look, the kind of look people give each other when they suddenly realize they might have a serious problem. "We'll have to look into that," one of them said, and the conversation moved on. I said nothing else. I didn't have to. This past weekend, my phone rang. It was Mary, retired now, a couple of years out from the job, but still close with her old colleagues. A friend still working at the university had called her. Someone had run a background check on Jake, and in the process of pulling his file, they'd found everything: his termination, his failure to complete the PhD, and the old complaint letters, over 20 years old, that still had Mary's name on them, listed alongside her husband, Jake's former faculty advisor. Mary thought she'd want to know, so someone had told her. As a bonus, buried in the file, was a record of his old arrest for the illegal animals. Apparently, his father had paid for a good enough lawyer years ago to eventually get the record expunged from standard background checks after the fines were paid and the charges reduced. But a deeper institutional file, the kind that doesn't disappear just because a lawyer files paperwork, remembered everything. I don't think he's getting that job. 20 years, and the same phone calls I made as a heartbroken 23-year-old were still, quietly doing their work. I didn't have to lift a finger this time. I didn't have to make a single call. All I had to do, 20 years ago, was tell the truth to the right people, and the truth simply waited, patiently, in a file, for exactly the right moment to matter again. There's something almost unbearably satisfying about that. I didn't sabotage him at that dinner. I didn't plan anything. I answered an honest question honestly, and the universe took it from there. That's the version of revenge that actually lasts. Not a scene, not a shouting match, just the truth, sitting quietly, waiting for its moment. Looking back now, as I happily fit into a pair of size 10 jeans I never think twice about, Here's what I want any young woman or man listening to this to take with them. If someone who claims to love you starts criticizing your body or your looks out of nowhere, that is their dysfunction to fix, not your job to shrink yourself around. And if you find yourself on the receiving end of comments like that, it might be worth asking what, or who, they're really trying to distract you from. If Jake had simply been honest with me, instead of trying to manufacture a reason for me to walk away, I might never have found out what he was really doing. His cowardice is what turned his own secret into his own undoing. He built the trap. I just happened to be standing there when it was ready to close. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button right now, and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying moment of real-life karma you've ever witnessed? I read every single one. And if you want more true stories like this, subscribe, because I promise you, this is not the last time the truth is going to catch up with someone who thought they'd gotten away with it.